Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Green Chemistry Connections webinar series. We're thrilled to have you here gathering with us once again, virtually from all over the world. Please do share with us where you are tuning in from in the chat box. We'd love to give you a shout out, and thank you so much for joining. Today's presentation will feature Dr. John Warner, our co-founder and also a co-founder of the field of green chemistry. My name is Amy Cannon. I'll be your host today. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Beyond Benign, a nonprofit organization dedicated to green chemistry education. The name of this webinar series has been updated to reflect the times that we're living in, Green Chemistry Connections. I think it's something that we're all striving for at this time where we're having to distance ourselves. We're looking for ways to come together. Today's webinar is brought to you in response to many industrial questions and industry-related questions that we received from John's Earth Day webinar and follow-up question and answer period on that. If you didn't get to join us for that webinar or the question and answer period, you can access them in our webinar archive, and a link has been added in the chat box that you can see, so you can directly access those. We're thrilled to have so many folks from different countries and different backgrounds joining us today. At Beyond Benign, we work across the continuum from K through 12 through higher ed and now supporting industry as we work together to prepare scientists and citizens to address sustainability through green chemistry. We see education as central to achieving a sustainable society, and we all need to work together to properly train and prepare students, educators, and professionals to face today's challenges. So I know we've got a lot of different folks joining us, K through 12 educators, we have industrial scientists, industry leaders, college university faculty, students, all joining us today, and each and every one of us have essential roles to play as we build a sustainable future together. This webinar is being brought to you by Beyond Benign, where our mission is to foster a green chemistry education community that empowers educators to transform chemistry education from cradle to career for a sustainable future. And building this community is now more important than ever. So thank you for being a part of this today, and we hope you stay engaged and involved. Please do sign up for our newsletter on the homepage of our website to be notified of any upcoming webinars or opportunities in K through 12, college and university and professional education. I want to take a moment before we begin to thank our sponsors and partners. These companies, foundations, organizations have been essential in advancing green chemistry education, and we really can't thank them enough for their leadership in this space and partnership and their continued support. So just reviewing some logistics briefly, we're broadcasting live and recording this session, so all attendees are in listen-only mode and all lines are muted. So if you have a question, just type it right into the chat box. We know we've received a good number of questions in advance of this webinar, so we're very excited to have John address those. But please do type them into the control panel at any time, and we're going to try to get some current questions too. So we're happy to have our higher education program manager, Natalie O'Neill, gathering and curating your questions in the background. And after John's presentation, we're going to address as many of them as we can. The recording will be posted on the link that you see on our webinars archive page and also in the welcome box. And any supporting documents will be posted on the link as well. For those of you who participate in social media, please connect with us on Twitter and Facebook, and we'd love to hear some live tweeting going on as always. And we do have our fabulous Juliana Vidal joining us all the way from Brazil to help moderate the conversation through social media during the webinar. So please reach out to her and engage with us by tagging Beyond Benign and you know, getting your message out there. So thank you so much for joining this webinar and being part of the community. So with that, we are very happy to have John Warner again joining us and really addressing this question: how does green chemistry help me do my job across the sort of industry sectors and across roles? So you know, John does not need too much of an introduction, but He is an inventor, he's an educator, he's a leader in green chemistry, a co-founder of the field, co-founder and co-author of the defining textbook, Green Chemistry Theory and Practice. Here at Beyond Benign, he's our co-founder and also director of science and innovation. He's the founder of the Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry. He's a distinguished professor of chemistry at Monash University in Australia. He's won numerous awards that span industry to academia, really addressing his leadership in the space of green chemistry, from the Perkin Medal, one of the highest awards in industrial chemistry, to some leading awards in education as well. So with that, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I'm going to hand it over to John at this time to take it away and get us started.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here to answer some of these questions. You know, it's kind of a continuation of the "We're All in This Together" Earth Day webinar that we had a month or so ago. Very happy to do the best that I can to answer the questions. I remind people from the Earth Day webinar that my disclaimer that I don't claim to have any gifted insight or any answers to all these questions. I am sharing with you my opinions, my views that have formulated over the years through different things that I've done, but I don't claim that my ideas or insights are any better than anybody else's. They're a way of starting a conversation and sharing our thoughts so that we can formulate this thing and co-create the future together. And so I've done the best that I can to address some of these questions that keep coming up about how does green chemistry help me do my job. Before I start, obviously, this was originally scheduled for June 10th. And I am super proud that we participated in the shutdown STEM program. This is, just such an important thing that we need to focus on and reflect upon and come up with just better ideas. I would like to put out to you that if you look at the textbook of chemistry, and you look at the textbook of chemistry that I had in 1980, and you compare it to the textbook of 2020, I would argue not a whole lot has changed. That we are teaching chemistry. Of course, the graduate electives and the other things have changed a little bit, but the fundamental textbook of chemistry is pretty much identical to what it was 40 years ago. And I would argue the field of chemistry has evolved, the world has evolved, and the problem is that we are not adapting and growing. And I find that is not unrelated to the subject, that we need new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of looking at things to truly create a sustainable thing called chemistry. And we desperately need the insights and the opinions and the ways to shape this future with a lot of additional people. And I passionately want to be part of helping this, but I also acknowledge how little I know about the real world of issues that we're facing together. And so anything that I can do to help, any thoughts that people have, I openly solicit. And I suspect that we at Beyond Benign will be focusing on this quite a bit in the future and soliciting input and advice. So thank you for any help that we can have together to make this happen. Back when we did the Earth Day seminar, just quickly in review, what I tried to do is present this concept of we take natural resources, we extract from them, and we make molecules and ingredients. Then we synthesize materials and components. Then we manufacture products. Then we hope to keep them in use and reuse. Then we do mechanical recycling back down to materials and components. Then we do molecular reprocessing back to molecules and ingredients. And then hopefully they degrade into natural resources. And these verticals I've identified as being the closed loop, the materials metabolism, and regeneration. And when people say, how can green chemistry help me do my job? Well, it's kind of hard to imagine anything that doesn't fit on this piece of paper somewhere in the materials world, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in purchasing, whether you're in research, whether you're in education. There's all kinds of opportunities there. When we do the invention, of course, there is the leakage that we discussed in the Earth Day webinar. And so from a high level perspective, it's useful to see the left-hand side of this diagram being green chemistry and the right-hand side of this being circular economy. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the left isn't circular economy and the right isn't green chemistry, but functionally the disciplines seem to break down in this area. But the point is that when we look at the form and we look at the composition, as elaborated in that previous webinar, it helps us see how moving a material from the left to the right and back again, it's useful to look at it from the form and the composition perspective. And there is a lot of work we need to do for a sustainable future in modifying and creating behavioral patterns that are facilitated by our product design. And to do that, there's a great deal of technology inventions that we need to create that are compatible with nature. And so essentially, whether you are working from the side of creating the demand and adopting behavioral patterns, or you're from the invention side and the chemistry side, we're all in this together. Now, my point, though, is when you look at form and composition, when the form and composition is conserved, there's very little bit you can do with it. When both are being altered, when you're altering the form and the composition, that's when you have the most degrees of freedom. That's where you can invent, that's where you can create, and that, in my opinion, is where green chemistry is critical. Now, again, I would argue it's along this entire chain, but that's where our opportunity for design and invention is. Now, as I mentioned, there's the combination of the materials ecology, taking the natural resources through manufacturing, distribution, use, and collection, but I feel that a closed loop kind of inhibits invention. If we assume that all the inventions we need have been done, then okay, that's fine. But I would argue that we still have a whole lot of invention that needs to be done. In my estimation, 65 to 70% of the technological unmet needs in circular economy and sustainability haven't been invented yet. This isn't an epic battle of good and evil where organizations are hoarding the better technologies. They truly haven't been invented. And the reason that is, in my opinion, is because we isolate what we call the materials ecology from the intellectual ecology, where the materials ecology looks at the molecules and the materials, but the intellectual ecology looks at where does invention come from? Where does inspiration and design, basic research, applied research, development, scale up and commercialization? And so when you look at the two of these overlapping like a Mobius strip and infinite connectivities, it's pretty obvious everybody in the materials world, whether you're a retailer or an inventor or in marketing, has a role, has something to do with green chemistry, right? Because when you get down to it, green chemistry, the design of chemical products and processes that reduce or eliminate the use of generation of hazardous substances. The key here is when someone says, what I do is not related to green chemistry, or I don't do green chemistry, what my ears hear is that literally that means that I wake up in the morning and I intentionally seek toxic, unsustainable technologies to work with, right? Now, assuming no one does that, then everyone does green chemistry. It is the design, the pursuit of materials that have mitigated impact. But what my argument is that because we as chemists in our training are not provided with the fundamental skills to address these issues, it comes off as an afterthought as opposed to a fundamental component of the design. And so that's where green chemistry is critical. That's why Beyond Benign is so important. That my dream is that when every university requires chemists and material scientists to have some fundamental understanding of what makes a molecule toxic, what makes a molecule hazardous to the human health and the environment, I believe that humans will figure this out and will invent better technologies. But if they don't have that training, they can't. It's as simple as that. And so the 12 principles of green chemistry are not meant as some commands on high, thou shalt do blank. What it is essentially an assistance tool in R&D and in sourcing and whatnot of how to create these technologies and identify and make available these technologies. Because it is absent in the self-definition of what it means to be a chemist, this is a helper for that. So my dream is one day that this becomes almost irrelevant, because every university from K through 12 and all around, people just recognize that this is just part of what it means to be chemistry. And so again, as I've said many times before, that for this to be successful, for this to get traction in the real world and accomplish the goals, yes, it has to be more environmentally benign, any new technology versus its incumbent technology, but that's not enough. It has to perform better and it has to cost better. And only if you have something that works better and costs better, and oh, by the way, is better for human health and the environment, that is true sustainability. Now, it's gonna take years, decades to accomplish this. So we will need government policies to facilitate this transition. There's gonna need to be all kinds of R&D. And so a future that we dream of may not be for several decades. So there is a period of time between where we are today and where we could be tomorrow. And that is not going to happen spontaneously. It's going to only happen by changing what it means to do and be and work in chemistry. And so the curriculum, the fundamental training of chemists from K through 12 on high is what's hard. So a good example is if we took any group of people, school children, university professors in chemistry, CEOs of companies, whatever, and we held up a glass of some liquid, let's say it's water, and we said, let's define this material. Someone's going to say it's a liquid. Someone's going to say it boils at 100. It freezes at 0. It's colorless. It has a viscosity of blah blah. But it's unlikely that anyone would look at that material and say, this is the toxicity of it. This is the impact on human health and the environment. For some reason, the field of chemistry has evolved through 300 years of evolution of modern chemistry to not see those descriptors as self-definition. And if we chemists don't do it, well, who does? And so that is the whole opportunity, is to not change the field of chemistry, but to add to the field of chemistry those additional descriptors from a fundamental perspective. So in thinking about putting together this presentation, at the same time I've been, how can we get to K through 12 education and even university education and have a teaching tool? So I like many people my age, I fondly remember the game Candyland. And so to help facilitate today's talk, I've actually constructed the game Green Chemistry Land. And what I'm going to do is go through the different questions for the thing. Now, if you look on the bottom right, you will see, if you remember from my presentation on Earth Day, that from my perspective, there are 4 components of the chemical enterprises. There's how we teach chemistry, there's how we do chemistry, there's how we invent chemistry, and how we manage chemistry. And if you think about every individual that has anything to do with molecules, materials, products, things like that, they fall into one of those categories. And so looking at that from that perspective, and being an insomniac that loves to make PowerPoint slides, I'm going to present to you green chemistry land. And so I will dazzle you with my skills here if it works. And we'll look at the spinner and we'll spin the spinner and see where it ends. Inventing green chemistry. So here we'll move our piece to the first red spot. And what is the potential of synthetic biology, enzymes, and bio-based solutions for sustainable chemical manufacturing? It's a really good question that came in. As you may know, that for the last several weeks, Beyond Benign has solicited questions that address how does green chemistry help me do my job? And so these are some of them. At the end, we will be able to take questions from people watching. And so as you submit questions in the chat, we'll add them to the end. But this one here, the potential of synthetic biology, enzymes, and bugs, I think is one of the most exciting frontiers for chemistry. When you think of the 12 principles of green chemistry, less toxic, less energy, one of the ones that right now we are really dependent on the petroleum-based feedstocks. And realistically, we've got to accept that we're going to be dependent on that for a long time. And so we can't just snap our fingers and say, let's stop making petroleum-based materials. It's going to take years and years and decades of invention to do that. And in some cases, it may make sense for durable goods to continue with these materials. But the point here is that if we transition and we try to seek bio-based materials, synthetic biology and enzymatic catalysis and things like that is going to be a critical form. And so this is really one of the big intersections between the biotech industry and the material science industry. That, a lot of time biology and biotech has been associated with drugs and pharmaceuticals and maybe some materials for the medical industry. But there's so much more in the materials world that we can start looking at making, actual materials and products. But it's going to take a lot of work, but this is an exciting future. And so we really need more of that intersection of biology and biochemistry and cell biology to help support this. I hope that's a useful answer to the person who asked that question. The next question, let's see where we end. Okay, teaching. So we move our piece to the yellow. How do I get my company to think about green chemistry? What's a good starting point, a discussion starter to move towards greener practices? Thank you for this question. I think this is an important question. And under the category of teaching, I think that what we sometimes forget is that we are always learning and we're always teaching. Every conversation, every form of communication, every interaction with another human, another individual, a group of people, we are simultaneously teaching and learning. And we should always respect that. And our co-workers, companies, whatever, if someone gets all excited and says, oh my God, I'm really into this green chemistry, and you're in an environment that doesn't get it yet, I think the first thing to recognize is, as I said in the beginning, unless you are purposely seeking to find toxic materials that hurt the environment, you're already doing green chemistry. The point, though, is you're not doing green chemistry really by design, but by haphazardness. I guess the way that I'd like to explain it is, I have an 8-year-old daughter, Natalie, and Natalie is an amazing, articulate little kid. I think all parents think this. She speaks in full sentences. She can read, she can write. Next year, she's going to start learning about nouns and verbs and sentence structure and adjectives. And one could say, well, why bother? She's already speaking. She's already reading and writing. She's already doing this. But I would argue that she's just getting by her environment, by her mother and father and her school. When she learns the parts of speech, when she learns sentence structure, she will operate at a much higher level. And not only the way she communicates to the outside world, but how she communicates to herself will just be elevated. I would argue the field of chemistry is the same thing. We know we want to make safe products. We know we don't want to poison ourselves in the lab. We know that if our customers get sick, it's going to be bad for sales. But like my 8-year-old daughter, we can't point to the classes when we became chemists for the sentence structure of safety and environmental protection. It wasn't part of who we are, so we're just winging it. What green chemistry is not saying we should make things that are safe and non-toxic. That's insulting. Of course, people know that they should make things that are safe and non-toxic and good for the environment. The problem is although you say you're doing it, do you really know how? Do you know what that really means? Can you point to that part in your education that trained you? And so I think a lot of time people look at this, well, obviously I do this. I don't want to poison people. But when you actually focus on this, isn't creating the desire, but actually questioning the fundamental ability. And if you're a company and you can do, remember, all the ways of doing pollution prevention, green chemistry is the one that addresses intrinsic hazard. So fundamentally, has a financial component to it that reduces cost and increases profit. Any other way of protecting human health and the environment by mitigating exposure just comes at an added cost. Green chemistry is the cost-effective way to do it that comes hand in hand. So there is an economical component to it. There is a accelerated time to market component to it. And of course, there's the moral and ethical component to it. So I think the way when we're trying to interact with people is not say you should be doing this because you're a good person, but saying, of course you're doing it, but do you really know how to do it? You know, wanting to play the piano isn't the same thing as taking piano lessons. Wanting to run a marathon isn't the same thing as being trained and practicing to run. Wanting to do green chemistry isn't the same thing as learning how to do green chemistry. So green chemistry are the set of principles that don't create the desire, but enable the ability. And so once we look at it from that perspective, unless you got some egotistical individual that thinks they can do everything in the world, they might actually honestly reflect upon their education, think, you know what, you're right. Okay, so let's spin the spinner and see where it goes. Oh, doing. So let's move up piece. I realize that this is a distraction. I had fun making these slides. How is green chemistry applied in the medical field? Okay, it's interesting in the history of green chemistry. I would argue that the pharmaceutical industry was one of the first industry sectors to embrace green chemistry. The book, Paul and I's book, came out in 1998. Buzz Q at the time was a vice president at Pfizer, who was probably the single most instrumental person in the pharmaceutical industry that brought green chemistry to Pfizer, started an internal green chemistry program, started it from research and development, created an internal award, and next thing you know, other pharmaceutical companies started to do it. If you reflect on the Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Award over the last 20-something years, many of the winners have been from the pharmaceutical and medical industry. Now, why? Why are they in? There's a couple different reasons. The first and obvious reason is if you're curing a disease, and in the process of curing the disease, you're working with materials that create diseases. Well, it's kind of a problem in and of itself. But sometimes in chemistry, that's unavoidable, but we got to do our best to mitigate that. But the point is that every time, if you're in manufacturing and you're creating waste and you're creating hazardous waste, that ends up as a massive cost in the pharmaceutical industry. So one thing is reducing the fundamental cost. The other part of it is that once a pharmaceutical company files a patent, the clock is ticking. You only have so much time to get that to market. If you have to rework the synthesis to address regulatory issues, issues of toxicity and environmental impact and the cost associated, and you delay entry to the market by any amount of time, that translates into sometimes catastrophic costs. And so anything you can do to hasten the time to market is going to help, and that's where green chemistry is. But the other thing that I think is very concerning right now is the issue of pharmaceuticals in the environment. As time has progressed. Just Google search, look at it up, pharmaceuticals in the environment. We're finding that in many municipalities, drinking water has, amounts of different pharmaceuticals that are accumulating, because most prescription drugs are, there is no average person. Everybody on this curve, and so most of us are overprescribed drugs, and then we end up excreting a vast amount of unmetabolized drug that gets out into the environment. Two ways of approaching that is invent better drugs that are more targeted, or inventing drugs that somehow, when they get out to the environment, degrade into innocuous materials. And so a lot to do. And then, of course, with medical devices, there's a lot in the news in which some medical device has been found to cause issues. So I think I might have missed something here. Yeah, we just did blue. So now let's spin the spinner again here. Now we do inventing. Oh, we got to see, if you do green chemistry, you get to take some side steps there. Isn't that cool? Is it possible to replace the non-renewable platform molecules with renewables, or is there a balance that should be maintained? This is a super important. Yes.
Can I add a question that just came in that I think builds on your question?
Okay.
It says, can a product manufactured by a bio-based product and a non-bio-based product be considered green chemistry? So I think it's related to this question, and I just wanted to bring in a recent one for you to address. Right. Thank you.
Okay, and it's interesting because it's addressed here too. Is it possible to replace non-renewable platform molecules with renewable platforms? Right now, if you take a material that is bio-based and you create a product that is bio-based, it is possible to do that without doing green chemistry. You could use nasty reagents, nasty processes, and actually have a nasty material from nature. So bio-based, you could do in a non-green way. You could take a multi-step industrial synthesis and do the principles of green chemistry and be quite green. And so as a default, a bio-based material versus a petroleum-based material, that statement in and of itself does not define whether it's green chemistry or not. All things being equal, looking at a sustainable future, one of the 12 principles says that a bio-based material is preferable than a petroleum-based material. But if you look at the work of like the Alliance to End Plastic Waste and organizations like that, while we recognize there is a future that we need to invent, we got the materials that we got for a very long time. And so there are 12 principles. If you can address 11 of the 12 principles and deal with those things, it is conceivable that a petroleum-based product is actually better from a green chemistry perspective than a bio-based process. So there is no panacea. And so there is a balance that needs to be maintained. All right, and so you can see the trend. And then so yes, bio-based is preferable in the long run, but realistically, we've got decades to go in doing that. So yes, there is a balance, and no panacea. Just because something's bio-based, you could have a lot of nasty processes going into that bio-based material. And so it's all 12 principles we need to be looking at. Now, again, it's a good time for me to point out that the enemy of the excellent is the perfect. And to my knowledge, no product is perfect. Every product needs to be improved. So this is a continuous journey that we're on. But we got to do the best that we can. We got to vow to do better tomorrow than we do today, better next year than we do this year, better in the future. But just saying, oh, we didn't address one of these principles, assuming that it's acceptable at some level, we gotta take what we can get. Okay, let's spin teaching. Okay. How can I introduce green chemistry to secondary students? Well, maybe someday we will have a game called Green Chemistry Land as a card game that people can play. Maybe. But it's important, again, remember my description of I'm holding the material up and we're naming it. We need to get elementary, middle school, high school, all levels of education to recognize that does making a material that is harmful for human health and the environment is not an absolute requirement. There is no law that says all red dyes must be a carcinogen. Some red dyes are a carcinogen. There's no law that says all plasticizers must cause birth defects. Some cause birth defects. And so when we look at the future, we got to recognize that there is a design component to these materials. And if we're addressing, well, I need the red dye to be, a certain color, and oh, I don't want it to fade in sunlight, and oh, I don't want it to oxidize in the air, and I want it to stick onto the surface. If we add to that, oh, by the way, and I don't want it to be toxic, and I don't want it to be harmful to the environment, it's just another design criteria. Now, we may not have the skill set, yes, to address it, but why wouldn't that be just another design component? And so when secondary students recognize that this is an opportunity of invention by extending what it means to be a chemist, and that if, Einstein had the quote, if we do something the way that we've always done it, we're always going to have the same results. We need new eyes. We need new ideas. We need creative insight to be part of the materials design ecology. And we need people that see the world differently. And so, showing, if you go to a class and hey, class, let's do chemistry, and you light something on fire, or you blow something up. Maybe in the 60s that worked. But now today, kids' Game Boys have more exciting explosions and more. And last time I checked, if you go into chemistry because it's exciting to blow things up and catch things on fire, you might want to choose a different career. So it's that way. But if you go to a class in a quiet voice, say, the world needs solutions to problems. People are being exposed to hazardous materials. The environment is being poisoned by the accumulation of these materials. We need new materials. Would you want to be part of that solution? What could be more empowering? Okay, I think that's the way to be introducing to all students and all people for that matter. All right, we spin green. Frequently, good legislation motivates companies to make important changes that may not figure into the bottom line. What do you feel is the appropriate role of government in green chemistry? Great, great question. We have the command and control mentality of a lot of government organizations and agencies. The whole point, the whole invention, if you will, of green chemistry, when Paul Anastas was in the EPA, is from switching to telling industry what not to do to helping industry identify what to do. And so if we look at the continuum of green chemistry from basic research to development to commercialization, and we look at that continuum, when we have government policies or NGO activity that addresses the demand, that a lot of people want these technologies. But what I'd argue we haven't been doing a very good job on is the supply side of that equation. If we right now today, snap our fingers, and every company insisted on only using technologies that are better for human health and the environment, if every researcher said, that's all I'm gonna do, if every manufacturer agreed to this, we're in trouble because we haven't invented them yet. All right, and so I think there's an opportunity for government to play a role not only from the environmental perspective, but from the economic development perspective. That if countries, if states, if different political organizations create an infrastructure to train in green chemistry, you're also tying that to a successful future economy by who wouldn't rather have materials, manufactured that are green chemistry materials. And so if we look at the continuity of invention and regulation. I think where government agencies can start playing a better role is in switching all the data that TSCA has assembled, all the data that the REACH legislation has assembled in the European Union. Much of that beautiful information is not put in a form that is conducive to the inventor. And if government agencies could find a way to translate all this regulatory information and somehow curate it for the inventor, now we've got an amazing opportunity. Everyone who is collecting information of what makes a molecule toxic, what is hurting the environment, if that information, think about it, if that information does not make it to the design table, to the inventor's ear, all we're doing is making people sad. All we're doing is making people despair. If we don't create a conduit to the inventing community and the design community, well, what are we doing? And that's the opportunity for government agencies, is to recognize that companies want to do green chemistry, but they can't because their workforce hasn't been trained. So are there incentives for training programs? Are there incentives for information transfer? That's where I think it should be in the government. Just a thought. All right, another managing question. How does green chemistry relate to the movements in government policies towards substitution and alternatives? Oh, good question. This one here, it's interesting. If you have regulatory structure that insists on using safer substitutions or safer alternatives, that presupposes that the safer substitutions and alternatives actually exist. And so much like the previous question, you can't force people to use a technology that hasn't been invented yet. I would argue that the Clean Air Act in the United States did not catalyze the invention of the catalytic converter. The catalytic converter was invented 6 years before the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act mandated its use. And so what we need to recognize is that a regulatory structure can only work if the alternatives exist. And sometimes I think there is a mistake that all the solutions are out there and it's just a matter of greed or something like that. That's not, and again, like I said, 65 to 70% of the technologies haven't been invented yet. So yes, we need to promote through a regulatory structure policies towards substitutions and alternatives. Absolutely, but we got to recognize that more times than not, there isn't a substitution and alternative. So what do? Do we just focus all of our regulatory issues with the things that have been invented and just throw our hands up and go, well, we don't have any other alternatives, so let's just, or do we cross that line and try to find a government structure to incentivize the changing of the education and communication of what it means to be a chemist? Okay, inventing. How can we invent green chemistry products and processes without greenwashing? If greener is always possible, how can we show this continued incremental improvement path? Very important. Greenwashing, greenwashing, greenwashing. Yes, greenwashing is a concern. Yes, greenwashing is a problem. However, there are two kinds of greenwashing. Greenwashing category 1 is an out and out lie. You have a nasty thing and you're pretending that it's good. That's bad. We need to address that. We need to prevent that. We need to do everything we can for any organization or individual to be misleading people. However, the second category is something that is touted as green, but we feel it's not green enough. And that one, I actually back off a little bit because that's not how science works. If I make a product that is more biodegradable, but I didn't address the energy concerns, well, that's okay. That's something. Now, if someone else addresses the energy concerns and then we combine them someday. That's how science works. But if everybody talk and keeps their mouth shut until there's perfect, and we don't even communicate the results, the enemy of the excellent is the perfect. The perfect does not exist. And so we need to recognize that there are all kinds of inventions that are necessary. And so that's so I'm a little bit different. And the problem that we have is if a company, the CEO of a company comes and says, look at our new product, we invented it with green chemistry and it addresses these things. Usually what many communities will do is start throwing stones saying, well, what about this? Well, what about this? And I think, wait, if an organization is putting their neck out, saying they have a technology, provided they're not lying and misleading people, if they say, wow, that's great, and they're given positive feedback, they will do more. If they get negative feedback, they'll say, screw it, why even bother? When we try to do something, we're still getting, and so we got to realize that the power of reaction is profound. And when it comes to green chemistry, yes, we cannot allow misrepresentations, but we all have different levels and gradations of what we want to celebrate. We got to be careful when we say it's not good enough, because that's just not how science works. All right. And so my attitude with greenwashing is to recognize that paradigm between category 1 and category 2. All right. We did green chemistry. We got to jump ahead. Can you please discuss the use of green chemistry in paper manufacturing? Paper manufacturing is an amazing thing. Obviously paper is cellulosic-based material from some level, vertical crop, as long as it's done sustainably and manageably. It's a great material. If we're saying, well, we got petroleum-based materials, we have cellulosic-based materials, vertical crops, paper. There are opportunities as long as they're managed appropriately and correctly. But how we actually take the materials from those crops, if you will, pretty nasty chemistry. And the other thing is that a lot of these materials are not recyclable. They degrade during the recycling process. And so coming up with better ways of inventing things that tolerate recycling, that's where, when we talk about the circular economy, it would be great to recycle paper forever. But right now, that's an invention away. Right now, we can't recycle paper because it degrades to molecular weights. You can recycle it a couple times, but the mechanical properties degrade. There are inventions that are acquired. And so paper is an excellent example of some unmet needs. Okay. Another doing. Does the current downturn in oil consumption create any actionable opportunities to make permanent positive environmental changes, particularly in the petroleum and plastics industry? I think yes. It's interesting. The cost has gone way down. So a few years ago, everyone was looking at bio alternatives because the cost was so high. As the cost has come down, this time, interestingly, because we've got behavior and we have invention, the behavioral community has done a pretty good job. That consumption has decreased. All right, and so that's pretty interesting that while the cost has gone down, people say, well, wait a minute, the consumption, because the cost is down, consumption is going to go through the roof. While there's obviously a relationship, there is a very, very recognizable trend of a downturn in the consumption. And so that does create an opportunity. And again, because it is very dangerous to be tied into the economics of oil. If the price goes up, the research isn't worth it. If the price goes down, back and forth, it's one of these things that we've got to recognize, that true sustainability is independent of those kinds of trends and things like that. So I think when we talk about bio-based, when we talk about these other things, again, in the plastics industry, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste and other organizations are desperately trying to find a path forward. But again, we got to recognize that it's inventions away, not time and effort, but inventions away. And so we need to sustainably and appropriately manage the materials that we're doing now, stop allowing them from getting into the environment, get them out of the environment, but ultimately we need to make materials that are compatible with the environment, as discussed in the Earth Day webinar. All right, managing. What organizations, resources, et cetera, is available to industries currently as guidelines for practicing green chemistry? These industry specific, or is there a general way to apply green chemistry across the supply chain? Very complicated question. The answer is briefly yes, that along the entire supply chain, the same question should be asked. Again, because if you superimpose on that the reality that 65–70% of the technologies haven't been invented yet. You may have a passionate desire for a better material, but it might not be invented yet. And that's where we need to recognize that while the 12 principles of green chemistry apply everywhere, there's going to be contexts in which what we're doing today may be addressing one of these things. And a supplier may be looking at something different than a retailer, who may be looking at something different than an inventor. And so the guidelines, the 12 principles, kind of speak for themselves. Beyond Benign has all kinds of resources. The American Chemical Society's Green Chemistry Institute has many different resources. And so the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council. And so I'd say that those three organizations, there are certainly many more, but the Beyond Benign, American Chemical Society's Green Chemistry Institute, and the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council are three very robust organizations that provide information for the practicing green chemistry up and down the supply chain. Okay, now I recognize that we're at the end here, so Amy, I don't know how you want to move forward. Should we, hey, the piece just moved forward. Do you want to close up here, or do you want to ask some questions?
We've got some questions. We have a good number of questions that have come in, so we've been trying to formulate some of them. I'm going to start with, I think, what you just moved it to, inventing. Is it best to focus on new innovative materials and make them the right way, or on replacements for materials of concern?
Both. Okay, so the thing is when we think of all products, most products are not individual materials. They are a formulation of many different components. If we say to ourselves, we want a drop-in replacement for this material, or an alternative way of making that material, that's great. And there are times when that is a very useful thing to do. But I would argue, when we move to real novel material, and our mindset is it has to be drop-in, that's not the point. What we should do is you look at the entire formulation, and as we take a new material that isn't the same old material made a better way, but is actually a different material, we may be able to address some of the other components in that formulation and make it more cost effective. So sometimes the search for the drop-in technology is a bit short-sighted, that one could actually really address costs if we look at the entire formulation and look at what that component is doing in the formulation, and that a substitute material may not require all the same additives that go into that formulation. Okay, do you got a teaching question for me?
I do. How about that? According to your experience, what kind of green chemistry outreach activities were efficient or have been efficient and successful at U.S. universities?
Okay, in my opinion, the individuals that are carrying out the outreach activity, if they care, if they're into it and they're passionate, it is effective. If it's formulaic and they're just ticking boxes and there isn't passion, children read that immediately and are turned off. And so at some overarching perspective, I would say I'm not so presumptuous to say one thing is better than another. It is that passion, it is that sharing of self, that we need to be vulnerable in sharing ourselves and our passion, and no matter what we're doing, it's going to be effective. If it's formulaic and ticking boxes, it is likely not to succeed. Now, having said that, there are many different ways of reaching out. I think the most important thing with outreach activity is not necessarily to have the outreach activity create a body of information that is measurable. Okay, did after this exercise, do the students know about the effect of detergents in the environment, or do the students now? That's not the point. I think the point, depending on the level of education, is to inspire the students to know that we are not dependent on these things, that we can create, that we can invent, and that they can be part of it. And so what is more important than the content has to be good, obviously, it has to be high quality, but the most important thing is probably not as measurable. It's that passion. Have you changed that individual so that they now want to do it? That, I think, is the more lasting outreach activities. Okay.
Yeah, great. And we've got some great resources on that too for engaging for student chapters and student groups to engage in outreach activities. Some great examples of student groups that we can throw in the chat box here for you too. All right, so we're on doing. This is a very specific to an industry sector, but I want to get to this question because I know this is an important area. We know how the metal finishing industry is locked into using chemicals that are inherently toxic. What changes can we and do we expect in this industry to provide the needed corrosion protection of metals? So again, very specific, but
yeah, and so having worked a little bit on alternatives to BPA can lining, metal coatings, and finishing and stuff like that, not in organic electrolysis ones, but organic polymeric ones, I do feel that there is a need for innovation. One thing that's interesting in any kind of electrolytic process, I would argue that a lot of metal finishing has to do with redox chemistry. And for some weird, quirky reason, the field of chemistry, if you think of a proton as a particle, an electron as a particle, and what we have done is we've evolved chemistry so that we talk about acid-base chemistry all first year. And then at the end, breathlessly go, oh, and by the way, there's stuff called redox chemistry. Do you realize that when you look at all the equations, the movement of a particle, whether it's a proton or electron, there's a lot of similarity between these things. And if we just arbitrarily years ago started chemistry using electrons as the particle and did electrochemistry first, and then breathlessly talked about acid base, we would have an entirely different relationship on chemistry. And so a lot of metal finishing has to do with electrochemistry, and there just isn't that much innovation. That there is some going on, but what an opportunity, because when you think about it, one of nature's greenest reagents is the electron. And so if we can rethink metal finishing to look at that electron as a reagent and how we deliver it and what materials, we have been stuck in a rut using the same kinds of materials, but I refuse to believe that there aren't all kinds of better ways of approaching it. It's just that we have a bias. The massive creativity in green chemistry is focusing on acid base and not redox. What an opportunity.
Great. So we have
got to jump forward because of green chemistry. Yeah.
I think we have one that's related to managing. How do we prioritize what we work on? How do we move from NGO wish lists that may or may not be the best lists to working on solutions that make a difference and are commercial successes?
So if you imagine a two-dimensional array, and one dimension is the criticality of the replacement. Man, the incumbent technology is nasty, and the replacement, we desperately need a replacement that is better. And then you look at the cost, the pragmatism, and time to actually create that technology, and you look at that two-dimensional landscape, we will be heartbroken to find that some of the most important unmet needs don't have a lot on the horizon. Some of the less important unmet needs have tons of solutions. And so I think one of the things we got to do is recognize that we're not looking at that whole big systems approach of where these unmet needs are. And so when we look at the entire landscape, some people say, we're covering this, we're covering this, we're covering this, we're covering this, and that's all great. But I think the most important thing is to find, where are the blind spots? What are the things that we're not doing? And those, I think, need to be prioritized, not only because they're important and unmet needs, but from a commercial profitability, those are going to be the ones that have the greatest opportunity commercially too. And so I think we need to be looking at both and recognizing we can't have it's not going to be easy. And we're going to have to catalyze the invention of these technologies. But we really got to look at that map and find out, what are we missing? And I think that's what we should be a priority. If there are 23 people, 23 organizations working on something, you probably don't need a 24th. But if there's no one working on some of these issues, we probably need to be focusing on that. Okay. Oh, we get to the end. Last one.
I think we're getting to the end here, yes, and we're a little bit past the hour, so if you can hang with us, we've got, I've got a question for you, John. Some industries and labs from underdeveloped countries still believe that translation to green chemistry implies losing profits or a big investment that they refuse to do. What would your strategy be to convince them?
Again, one of the things to recognize is that a country that has an established chemical industry, to come up with new technologies, there is a sunken capital base that would require rebuilding factories, tearing things down, remodeling, rebuilding, and that sometimes becomes an inhibition to newer technologies because, well, man, we already have these factories. In a way, it's kind of a leveling playing field that a country that doesn't have as established of an industry base has the opportunity to do it right from the beginning, and a competitive advantage because they don't have the takedown economics that they have to deal with. So I would argue there's an opportunity to grow industry that is green in this way. And so in a way, I look at an established company that's been manufacturing something for decades. My heart goes out to them because of the economics. They're kind of stuck with those same things. But if someone builds a new factory, if some company builds a new product factory and they don't do green chemistry, oh my God, that's just not cool. All right, so I can understand if it's already being manufactured, but how can we in 2020 rationalize building a new factory that isn't attempting to be consistent with the principles of green chemistry? And so in developing countries that have an opportunity to build a manufacturing base, I think this is a level playing field.
Did we win the game?
Yeah, we got to the end. Look at this guy is jumping up and down and the arrow's going up. So
and where can we get a copy of this game to play for home use?
Well, seeing that just about 2 hours ago I finished this, so we're on it. We're going to work on it. We're gonna make this available. Yeah.
Great. So I'm gonna see if I can take the controls back from you, John. This has been really wonderful to get to some of. I know we weren't able to get to all the questions. We still had some just coming in, like just now. So I apologize if we didn't get to your specific question. Please, here I'm going to show you guys our. Actually, I'll please, feel free to send us an email or send John a direct email as well if we didn't get to address your question, or if you have additional things that you'd like to discuss. And so yeah, and again, thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you to John. This has been really wonderful and thought-provoking. So thinking about how this applies in our daily lives is just essential. So thank you so much for that. Please do share any ideas that you have for future Green Chemistry Connections webinars. We do look at those suggestions and take them seriously. So please do share those with us. Please connect with us. And thank you so much. Again, our recordings and supporting documents are listed on our webinars archive page, which should be in that chat box as well. And you can sign up for our mailing list on our homepage for notifications about future webinars. So please make sure you do that as well. So with that, thank you again, John, and thank you to everyone so much for joining in with us today.
Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you.